All right, welcome. What we're going to be talking about in this lesson is we're going to be looking at states, nations, regimes, kind of different ways regimes are set up and things like that. So why don't we go ahead and just hop into this and we'll start looking at some of these terminologies. All right, terms that you've got to know. So really what we're going to be looking at, we don't have any big narrative or anything at this point, but really what we're going to be looking at here is just some different terminology, some things that we need to understand in order to be successful in the class and to be able to kind of understand the terms that are going to be used throughout the semester. The first thing that we need to understand is the concept of government. A government is a particular set of institutions and people authorized by formal documents, such as a constitution, that have the authority to pass laws, issue regulations, control the police, and so on. So when we look at those institutions in the United States, we've got local government, we've got state governments, we've got the federal government. And within those you have lawmaking bodies like Congress. You have the executive branch, which is supposed to enforce those concepts. You have the judicial branch that determines the constitutionality of those laws and determines whether something's illegal or not illegal and different things like that. So those are the government institutions that we have here in the United States. Now, each country that we're going to look at this year is going to have different institutions that are in charge of doing these things. When we look at England, we're going to see Parliament. When we look at Russia, we're going to have a mixed presidential and parliamentary system. When we look at China, everything's going to be run by the party. When we look at Mexico, they've got a very similar federal structure to the United States. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. Nigeria, we're going to see a very military-oriented style of government. And in Iran, it's going to be the most confusing thing you've ever seen because there's lots and lots of different things that go on with Iran's government. All right, so that's what a government is. They are the institutions that pass laws, they issue regulations, and they control the police and the military and things like that. And in some cases, the military is the one who does those things. Then we also have the concept of a regime. A regime refers to the institutions and practices that typically endure from government to government, or in American terms, administration to administration. So when we switch from one president to another, we don't completely scrap the way that our government works. Pretty much all of those organizations continue to exist from president to president. And if we do that from dictator to dictator, or if we do that from prime minister to prime minister, everything that continues to exist from one leadership to the next, that is what we refer to as the regime. And if we see a regime change, that means that you get rid of all those institutions and you institute a new type of institution. All right? The nation. This is a psychological rather than institutional concept. We use nation pretty loosely when we talk about things on the news and we talk about things in kind of everyday conversations. But nation has a very kind of strict definition that a lot of times gets lost in translation. So a nation refers to the cultural, linguistic, political, and other identities that can tie people together. All right. So when you're proud of where you're from, when you're proud of your political history, when you're part of that cultural, linguistic concept, that is what we refer to as a nation. All right. And we're not going to necessarily see a whole bunch of that. We'll see it a little bit in Russia when we talk about it, but when we talk about nations, a lot of times we think about talking as countries, but there are nations that exist within countries. So in some countries you have multiple nations that exist because of these linguistic, cultural, political concepts. All right, nationalism is the sense of belonging and identity that distinguishes one nation from another. And I guess one example that I could probably use as far as the United States goes, it would be Native American tribes. Native American tribes refer to themselves as different nations and things like that. They've got similar languages, they've got similar culture, they've got a singular political identity. So all of those things would be why we would refer to those as a nation. All right. Then we have a civic nation. A civic nation is one in which the state derives its political legitimacy from the active participation of its citizenry. All right. So if you get that nationalistic concept because the people are super involved in their country and they vote and they do all of these different things, that's what we would refer to as a civic nation. All right, so that's what a nation is. What's a country? A country is a distinct politically defined territory that encompasses governments composed of political institutions as well as cultures, economies, and collective identities. So when we look at country, we are really looking at the lines that we draw on the map. So that is what we would refer to as a country, when we can see that strictly politically defined territory. All right, and then kind of everything that's within that. A state. A state includes all the institutions and individuals that exercise power. States are almost always the most powerful cluster of institutions. So when we refer to something as the state, We're talking about the actual institutions and the people who run those institutions. All right. And then we have a nation state. A nation state exists when national identity and states' boundaries coincide. So if an entire nation concept, if all of those people and all of those people within the government and all within that border, that's what we would refer to as a nation state. All right, democracies. While the definition of what a democracy is still sometimes contested, it is generally agreed that the following criteria must exist for democracy to exist. You have to have free and fair elections, so universal suffrage. Suffrage just is the ability to vote, so that if you have suffrage, then you have the ability to vote. Multiple parties have the right to form and argue against one another freely. So in the United States, for the most part, we just have Democrats and Republicans. When we look at England, we're going to look at the Labour Party, we're going to look at the Liberal Democrats, we're going to look at the Conservative Party. So when we look at these democracies, there are going to be multiple parties that have the right to exist, and they have the right to freely argue with each other. Democracies generally either have a multi-party system, which means that there are more than two parties, that's what we see in England, or a two-party system of government like we see in the United States. All right, transparency exists within the government if a democracy exists. And what transparency means is that you know what the government is doing. They are very open about the things that they are doing. They're trying to freely share the things that are going on within the government. They're trying to make sure that their citizenry is educated about the issues that exist within the nation. All citizens possess political rights. So free speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, a lot of those basic rights that we have that consist of our Bill of Rights, those are those political rights that have to exist. All right, the legal system has to be based upon the rule of law. And we're going to look at a couple of different ways that the rule of law can exist. But the rule of law means that there are laws that exist, and even the people who are in power have to follow them. So all people are bound by the law, and if you break the law, then you can be punished for breaking that law, regardless of what your station within the society is. All right. The elected officials have the ability to exert control over the military and over private power holders. All right, so that government is kind of the end-all, be-all, and the elected officials have the right to be able to do things. But within that, generally, or always within a democracy, is that the people have the right during elections to be able to cast those people out later on. All right? There's a commitment to resolving conflict within the nation peacefully. All right, so rather than every time that there's a disagreement about what's going on in the country, rather than going to war, which is a lot of times what you'll see, say, in a place like Nigeria, which we're going to study later on in the year, that democracies have a way of peacefully resolving those issues. And democracies use non-coercive power, so they don't use the government to force people physically or mentally to do things, that the government is there to serve the people and carry out the will of the people. All right? A democratic regime is based upon the authority of the people. And that's a huge concept. So when we go back to the Enlightenment, which is really where democracy stemmed from, and John Locke, who was one of the main fathers of this concept of democracy, is that when you look at democracy, people not only have the responsibility to be responsible for what happens within the government, but if the government decides to do things that aren't what's best for the people, then the people have not only the right but the responsibility to cast that government aside. All right, so in a democratic concept, really the authority of all power stems from the people, from the electorate, because those are the people who put people in business. All right? So when we look at it, there are a few different types of democracies that we can look at here. We've got indirect democracies. These exist when elected officials are elected to make decisions for the people. That is the type of government that we have. We have a republican form of government in the United States, so we are more of an indirect democracy. We vote for people who then go make decisions for us. All right? Then there are direct democracies. Direct democracies exist when individuals have immediate say over the decisions that government makes. So if we were to go to the polls every time a law was going to be passed, that would be what a direct democracy would do. In a liberal democracy, they have democratic procedures in place but have significant restrictions on them. And largely, most of the time when we look at these restrictions, they're going to be restrictions on civil rights and civil liberties. Russia is very largely considered to be in a liberal democracy. They can also be known as procedural democracies. All right. Then we've got liberal democracies. Liberal democracies exist when the rights of an individual are protected by law. Okay, and we have that here in the United States. We are also a liberal democracy because we have all of these things ensconced in the Bill of Rights, and all of these rights and protections are guaranteed by our Constitution. And then you have advanced democracies. And these are countries with institutional democracy and high level of economic development and prosperity. So the United States, England, Germany, all of these would be advanced democracies. Right? Democratic governments typically have three major branches of government. Typically, and we're going to see exceptions to this, but typically you see an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. All right. Parliamentary systems. And this is going to kind of go along with what we're going to talk about with the UK when we get to them in the next unit. All right. So parliamentary systems. These work with citizens vote for the legislative representatives of the country, but then those legislatures select the executive. So in the United States, we vote for the president, and we know who the president is going to be when we vote for them. When you vote in England, you're not voting for the prime minister. Now, you know who the leader of that party is, and you know who's probably going to be prime minister when you vote for the party that you support. But you're only voting for your person, and the prime minister, who is the leader of the government, they are just the head of the majority party. Right? Parliamentary systems are based upon something called parliamentary sovereignty. So when we look at, like in the United States, and we look at a lot of democracies where they've got those three branches, there's generally some sort of separation of powers. You know, the executive branch has some powers, the legislative branch has some powers, the judicial branch has some powers. When we look at the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, all of those powers are vested and exist within Parliament. So there is no separation of powers. There is no basis of differentiation between branches of government because they don't really exist. All right? So when we look at this, it's the idea that the cabinet makes the decisions of the legislature because of their party or coalition has the majority in the legislature. And what the majority wants goes. The parliamentary system also has separation between head of state and head of government. So when you look at the UK, and we'll talk about this in more detail later on, the head of state is really a ceremonial role, very symbolic. The Queen really doesn't have any real power within the UK. And then you've got the head of government, who is the one in charge of making sure that all the day-to-day operations of the government take place. All right. In presidential systems, like we talked about just a second ago, citizens vote for legislative representatives independent of executive leaders. So we vote for the people who are going to go to our Congress, and then we vote for the people who are running for president. And those are very separate concepts, which that's not separate within a parliamentary system. All right. And we also have a separation of powers between branches of government based upon checks and balances. All right. In semi-presidential systems, which is what Russia has, some countries combine elements of the presidential and parliamentary systems. This is especially true of Russia's governmental system. In a semi-presidential system, there's a sharing of power between the president, prime minister, and parliamentary body. And when we get to Russia, we'll spend a lot more time going into detail as far as how that government works. All right. Then we have authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. In authoritarian regimes, decisions are made by political elites. Decision-making generally takes place without much or any input from citizens, and authoritarian regimes may exist with single dictators, a hereditary monarch, a small group of aristocrats, or a single political party. All right, so any of those things can exist. Many authoritarian regimes are based upon communism. And really when we look at what communism theoretically is and what communism really was, the communism that we know that went into practice is very different than what communism is theoretically. All right, in these regimes, the government controls and plans everything centrally. All right, and authoritarian regimes generally rely on coercive power, so they are going to force you to do the things that you're supposed to do. Now, totalitarian regimes, it means that there's complete and total control. So even though authoritarian regimes have pretty much total control, totalitarian regimes are even more oppressive than authoritarian regimes. Right. Corporatism is generally a key component of authoritarian regimes. Corporatism is an arrangement in which government officials interact with people and groups outside the government before they set policy. So what they do is they interact with these groups, they see which groups have favor with others, and they then try and institute the policy based upon the fact that they know that these groups are loyal to them. And we're going to see corporatism, and we're going to use some different names for it, but we're going to see corporatism exist pretty much in every single country that we look at. All right. Corporatism is largely based upon what we refer to as patron-client systems. And this is where the government provides benefits such as government jobs and beneficial policy decisions in order to gain the support of the people within the specific group. So it's kind of a cyclical thing. They go and find the groups that they know are going to support them, They get some policy inputs. They make beneficial policy decisions for them, which is going to gain their support. And it's kind of the cyclical nature of trying to keep their support because they're the ones that have the majority of the power. All right, like we said with a totalitarian regime, it's similar to an authoritarian regime in that they are typically more repressive and are often hated. All right, and this is a video that you should watch on your own time when you download the PowerPoint that's going to give you a little bit more information about authoritarian and totalitarian governments. All right, theocratic regimes and anarchy. And anarchy, we're really not going to spend a whole bunch of time talking about it. Anarchy is really just the absence of government. All right, but theocratic regimes are those that base all governmental decisions on religious beliefs. All right, theocratic regimes are generally very oppressive and have strict control on citizens' civil rights and civil liberties. And the only theocratic regime that we're going to look at this year is Iran. All right, then we've got the concept of military rule. Military rule is prevalent in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Military rule generally stems from a coup d'etat. So when we talk about a coup d'etat, that means that it is somebody within the military that is forcefully taking over the government. And most of the time that results in the previous leader being shot in the head. All right, military rule generally lacks a specific ideology, and the leaders often have no charismatic or traditional source of authority. And we'll talk about sources of authority later on. All right, then we've got LDCs, or less developed countries. There are currently over 130 countries considered LDCs. They are poor, they have poor health care, they have a large number of young people, they have huge rates of illiteracy, and their governments face grave issues. So when we talk about LDCs, there are lots and lots and lots of social construct problems. All right. These problems include a lack of functioning courts, where either the courts don't exist at all or the courts that do exist are really unfair. The bureaucracies are really inefficient, and then there's a lack of government infrastructure. All right, LDCs are often referred to as third world countries, which we talked about previously. All right, and then we have what we refer to as newly industrializing countries. And these are states that have started the process of industrialization to break out of their impoverished states, but they're really kind of on their way of trying to make their way to the top. All right, then we've got types of states. We've got strong states. Strong states are defined as a state that can take on more responsibilities and generally carry them out efficiently, and definitely more efficiently than a weak state. Strong states are generally wealthy. The regimes have widespread support, and their governing elites work reasonably effectively together. All right. A weak state is the opposite of a strong state, and a failed state is a state in which there is no functioning government and everything is collapsed. All right, and that's it for this lesson.